Hello, everyone. A temporary ceasefire with Iran has been extended, but no one in the region is treating it as a settlement, and no one in Israel is pretending the danger has passed. The White House says President Trump wants what it calls a unified response from Iran's leadership to his proposals for ending the war, but the extension came without a firm deadline, and the apparent pressure point now falls on Sunday, when both Washington and Jerusalem will be watching to see whether diplomacy holds or the fighting resumes. That uncertainty is the story. The United States remains focused on Iran's nuclear program, while Israeli officials are openly skeptical that a deal can be reached under the current conditions. The core issues are still unresolved. The two sides remain far apart, and the ceasefire is being treated less like peace than like a pause in a conflict that may be entering its next stage. At the same time, the military pressure has not disappeared. The United States is maintaining its naval blockade on Iran, while Tehran has continued detaining vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and has reportedly opened fire on ships moving through the area. The USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group is also advancing toward the Persian Gulf and is expected to enter optimal operating range in the coming days. Let that sink in. While leaders are talking about negotiations, aircraft carriers are moving. Ships are being stopped, and one of the world's most important maritime choke points is now sitting at the center of a rapidly evolving confrontation. The Strait of Hormuz has become the pressure point everyone is watching. It is narrow, strategic, and economically vital, but it is also now wrapped in uncertainty. Reports from the area remain conflicting, with claims that Iranian shipping has been halted, that American forces are preventing some vessels from entering the Gulf, and that other ships have still managed to cross despite the risks. According to analysts following the situation, the shipping disruption may be temporary because no one yet knows how long the ceasefire will last. But the uncertainty around Hormuz is not isolated. It is connected to the wider diplomatic track, including difficult talks with Lebanon, ongoing military pressure on Iranian-backed forces, and the broader question of whether Tehran believes it has survived the worst of the war. Here's the thing. The situation in the strait is not simply a question of whether ships are moving. It is a question of whether the United States and Iran are testing each other in real time, under conditions neither side fully planned for in advance. Some vessels are reportedly attempting to cross, despite Iranian efforts to prevent passage. Iran has taken action against ships involved in those attempts, while rumors continue that American forces have stopped other vessels near the entrance to the Gulf. One report suggested that roughly 34 ships managed to move through, but even that figure remains surrounded by uncertainty. The mine situation is also unclear. There may be mines in the waters, but no one publicly knows how many there are or where they have been placed. That means every crossing attempt carries not only military risk, but also the possibility of accidental escalation. This is the fog of war in its most literal form. Ships are moving through contested waters, commanders are making decisions under pressure, and political leaders in Washington and Tehran are adjusting their positions while events develop around them. For President Trump, this creates a difficult problem. The blockade is meant to pressure Iran into accepting American terms, especially on the nuclear file. But if the blockade does not produce concessions, Washington may face the question it has been trying to avoid, whether additional military action is required to force a different Iranian calculation. Inside Iran, the picture appears just as complicated. The United States has pointed to internal divisions in Tehran as one reason the negotiations are stalled, and those divisions now seem increasingly visible. The split is not new, but the war has made it harder to conceal. On one side are the hardliners, led by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and those who see defiance as essential to regime survival. On the other side are more pragmatic figures who have long believed that lifting sanctions is necessary if the regime wants to preserve itself economically and politically. But without a strong central figure able to balance these factions, the Iranian leadership appears to be struggling to produce a coherent position. In a moment of pressure, the safer political move inside Tehran may be to sound more radical, not more flexible. That is why the public demands coming from Iran have appeared to harden rather than soften. Iranian officials have insisted that the Strait of Hormuz belongs to them. They have described nuclear enrichment as non-negotiable. They have demanded that the United States pay reparations for our wartime damage. Each of these positions moves Tehran farther away from the American negotiating framework, not closer to it. The deeper question is whether Iran's leadership actually believes it lost. According to Israeli security analysts, the answer may be no. Tehran has absorbed severe blows, but the regime does not appear to feel that its survival is in immediate danger. That matters because regimes under pressure behave differently depending on whether they believe they are wounded or truly threatened. If Iran's leaders believe they can remain in power, they have every incentive to project strength. If they show weakness, they risk encouraging domestic opponents, regional rivals, and foreign adversaries to conclude that the moment has arrived to push harder. That is why compromise may be so difficult. A softer position on the nuclear program could be interpreted inside Iran as surrender. A concession on Hormuz could be seen as proof that the regime can be coerced. And for hardliners whose legitimacy rests on resistance, that may be politically unacceptable. The result is a deadlock. The United States wants an agreement that guarantees Iran cannot obtain nuclear weapons. Iran wants to show that it has not been defeated. Israel wants to make sure the nuclear threat is not simply postponed until the next crisis, and no side wants to be seen as the one that blinked. In Israel, the public mood reflects that uncertainty. Many Israelis are not asking whether the conflict is over. They are asking when it might resume, what the next round could look like, and whether Iran is using the ceasefire to regroup. That skepticism is rooted in experience. Israel has already fought a previous round with Iran, and the latest conflict has lasted long enough to convince many that a temporary halt does not mean a strategic resolution. A ceasefire can stop the shooting, but it does not automatically change Tehran's ambitions, capabilities, or long-term plans. There is also a growing concern that Iran may be playing a longer game. If Tehran believes it can outlast Washington politically, especially by exploiting American domestic fatigue, then it may have little reason to accept a hard deal now. It may simply wait, absorb pressure, and bet that the United States will eventually move on. American public opinion is part of that equation, but it may not be the decisive one. President Trump knows that another war in the Middle East is not broadly popular beyond his most committed supporters. But analysts argue that his priority is not simply popularity. It is the ability to claim a decisive outcome. For Trump, the political prize is clear. He wants to say that he achieved what previous administrations failed to achieve, a deal that blocks Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and does so on stronger terms than the arrangements associated with Barack Obama or Joe Biden. That comparison matters deeply to him, and it may shape the pressure campaign now unfolding. So Washington's logic appears to be this: keep the blockade in place, increase economic and military pressure, and force Iran to conclude that its regime's survival is at risk unless it makes concessions. Only then, the thinking goes, might Tehran consider meaningful movement on the nuclear program. But that strategy carries risks. If the regime does not bend, the United States may have to decide whether to escalate. And if escalation comes, it may not begin with symbolic strikes. It could involve attacks on infrastructure designed to create a level of pressure Iran cannot ignore. This is where Israel's security establishment is watching closely. A resumed war could unfold in Iraq, but it could also restart in Lebanon, where Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed forces remain active despite ceasefire arrangements. The region is not dealing with separate crises. It is dealing with one Iranian network expressed through multiple fronts. That brings us to another urgent development: the changing debate inside the United States over support for Israel. In the shadow of the war against Iran, a recent Senate vote on arms sales exposed a sharp partisan split. Only 7 Senate Democrats supported the sale, while 40 voted against transferring weapons to Israel, including defensive systems. That vote has caused alarm in Jerusalem. Israel is not Japan, Germany, or South Korea, even though some critics have argued that it should be treated like any other American ally. Those countries host tens of thousands of American troops, operate within treaty frameworks, and depend on formal American defense commitments. Israel does not. Israel buys much of its weaponry from the United States. These are purchases from American contractors, not charity in the simple sense. And yet the political ground beneath that relationship appears to be shifting. For Israeli analysts, the message is stark. Bipartisan support for Israel can no longer be assumed. The Democratic Party is changing. The Republican Party also has strains of isolationism, and Israel may be entering an era in which its defense doctrine has to adapt to a less predictable America. One answer already being discussed is expanded domestic production. Israel cannot manufacture everything it needs, and no one seriously suggests that it can replace the full range of American systems, including aircraft like the F-35. But whatever can be produced locally may now become part of a broader strategy to reduce dependency. That shift did not begin only with the Senate vote. It accelerated after October 7th, when Israel's security assumptions were shattered and the country concluded that it could no longer tolerate hostile terror. Armies deployed along its borders. That new doctrine now applies to Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Judea, and Samaria, and Iran itself. The principle: is simple, even if the implementation is extremely difficult. Israel wants to prevent armed Iranian-backed forces from embedding themselves on its frontiers, building rocket arsenals, and waiting for the right moment to attack. It also wants to make sure Iran never reaches the point where it can produce nuclear weapons under the protection of that regional network. But the American factor remains central. Israel may try to reduce dependency, but its long-term security still benefits enormously from a strong relationship with Washington. That is why the erosion of bipartisan support is not just a political inconvenience. It is a strategic warning. Israeli officials and analysts increasingly argue that the country must rebuild its ties, not only with Republicans, but also with Democrats. Some warn that Israel became too comfortable with strong support from the Republican majority and the Trump White House. That comfort may have created blind spots about what was happening inside the Democratic Party. This is not only a problem for the government of Israel, it is a problem for the state of Israel. If support for Israel becomes permanently partisan, the security relationship will become vulnerable. Every time to power changes hands in Washington, there is another uncomfortable point. By January of 2029, the United States will have another president. No one can assume that the next administration, regardless of party, will be as supportive of Israel as the current one. That means Israel has to plan now for a more uncertain future. At the same time, some American opponents of current policy appear to acknowledge that the Iranian regime is a major threat, but still refuse to support actions associated with President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu. That political filter may now be overriding geopolitical judgment. In other words, even when there is broad agreement about the danger posed by Iran, domestic polarization in the United States can still block a unified response. This is one of the defining tensions of the moment. The Iranian regime may be one of the clearest strategic threats in the Middle East, but American politics is no longer organized solely around strategic consensus. It is organized around identity, party loyalty, and opposition to particular leaders. Supporters of the current American approach argue that Trump understands Iran's danger clearly. They say he sees the regime not only as a threat to Israel, but as a threat to American interests, regional stability, military security, and the global economy. They also argue that his ambiguous messaging is deliberate, part of a pressure game designed to keep Tehran guessing. But ambiguity only works if it produces results. If Iran uses the uncertainty to stall, regroup, and harden its terms, then Washington may face a narrowing set of options. The ceasefire could end, and fighting could return to Iran itself, possibly even around Tehran, depending on how far the escalation goes. For now, there appears to be little appetite for a renewed war. But appetite is not the same as inevitability. If no agreement is reached, and if the blockade does not force Iran back to the table with acceptable positions, the United States may conclude that military pressure has to resume. That is the question hanging over the region. Not whether the ceasefire exists on paper, but whether it can produce a real agreement on Hormuz, on enrichment, on nuclear guarantees, and on the future of Iran's regional proxies. And one of those fronts is Lebanon. Lebanon is reportedly seeking a one-month extension of the ceasefire between Israel and forces operating from its territory, with a second round of direct talks expected at the State Department in Washington. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun has said that contacts are underway to extend the ceasefire period, which began last week and is also set to expire on Sunday. Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam has discussed his country's position with French President Emmanuel Macron, who has inserted himself into the diplomatic process. The public language coming from Beirut is cautiously diplomatic. The reality on the ground is much more fragile. Over Israel's Independence Day, Hezbollah violated the ceasefire with rocket launches aimed at disrupting diplomacy between Israel and the Lebanese government. The group fired several rockets on Tuesday night, though most of its activity remained focused on Israeli soldiers operating in southern Lebanon. No casualties were reported. Israel's response has so far been calculated. The Israel Defense Forces said they struck the rocket launchers used in the attacks while avoiding a broader escalation that could collapse the talks. Alert sirens still interrupted the holiday in far northern Israeli communities, and at least one explosive drone was shot down before entering Israeli airspace. Israeli forces remain deployed in southern Lebanon, searching for weapons and clearing Hezbollah infrastructure. The purpose is to prevent threats from returning to the Israeli home front. But the political challenge is just as important as the military one. Can the Lebanese state act independently of Hezbollah, or is Hezbollah still strong enough to veto Lebanon's future? That is the fracture now visible inside Lebanon. The government, excluding Hezbollah and many Shiite factions aligned with it, appears to be trying to build some form of direct diplomatic channel with Israel. Hezbollah, by contrast, seems determined to prevent that process from gaining momentum. This may be one of the most serious internal Lebanese standoffs in decades. There are positive signs, direct talks, public statements from Lebanese leaders, and at least some willingness to explore arrangements that would reduce conflict. But there are also serious limits. The Lebanese government has struggled to enforce its authority. It reportedly tried to expel the Iranian ambassador and failed. Hezbollah operatives have been detained over illegal arms and then released on bail. The state says some of the right things, but the question is whether it can act on them. There is also an important distinction. Israel has a ceasefire with Lebanon, but the war was never truly against Lebanon as a state. The deeper question is whether Israel has a ceasefire with Hezbollah. On that point, the answer is much less clear. Hezbollah is not currently firing at full force. Its attacks appear more like an attempt to save face than an all-out campaign to destroy the talks. If Hezbollah wanted to completely blow up the diplomatic track, Israel would likely be seeing more than 7 or 8 attacks over the course of a week. Still, calculated violence is still violence. Hezbollah may be trying to bait Israel into a larger response and then accuse Israel of being the aggressor. It is a familiar strategy to provoke, absorb a limited strike, then use the strike as political proof that diplomacy cannot work. For Israelis in the north, this is not theoretical. Residents near the border heard explosions in southern Lebanon while celebrating Independence Day. For them, ceasefire violations are not abstract reports from diplomats. They are sounds carried over the hills from a front that has not gone quiet. The deeper structure is clear. Hezbollah remains an Iranian-backed force embedded inside Lebanon, and Iran continues to treat Hezbollah as one of its most important strategic assets. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has reportedly made protection of Hezbollah a priority, even as Tehran negotiates with the United States over the fate of its own population and economy. That tells you something important. For Iran, Lebanon is not just another foreign policy issue. Through Hezbollah, Lebanon functions as a forward base against Israel, a pressure tool against the region, and a bargaining chip in negotiations far beyond Beirut. Israel's strategic goal is to break that chain from both ends. On one end, strike and pressure Iran, the source of money, weapons, and direction. On the other end, weaken Hezbollah on the ground in Lebanon so that it can no longer dominate the border or hold the Lebanese state hostage. But Hezbollah may not yet be weak enough for the Lebanese government to fully confront it. Beirut fears civil war, and that fear is real. A government that moves too aggressively against Hezbollah without sufficient internal strength could trigger a domestic crisis it cannot control. That is why Israel is unlikely to rely entirely on Lebanon to solve the problem. Jerusalem may welcome partners in Beirut, but it will not outsource its border security to a state that has repeatedly failed to disarm Hezbollah. The practical expectation is more limited. Create pressure from multiple directions. Strengthen anti-Hezbollah elements where possible, and continue military action when threats emerge. Syria adds another layer. President Ahmed al-Shara has been traveling through the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, in what appears to be an effort to build regional backing for Syria's new direction. That movement could matter greatly for Israel. Israel and Syria now have overlapping interests, especially when it comes to stopping the smuggling of weapons and drugs across the Syria-Lebanon border. Syria wants control over its territory. Israel wants to prevent arms from reaching Hezbollah. Saudi Arabia, as a major supporter and investor in the new Syrian leadership, also has an interest in reducing Iranian influence. This creates the outline of a possible regional alignment. Israel, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states may not share the same history or politics, but they share a concern about Iran and its proxies. In the Middle East, that kind of shared threat can sometimes open doors that ideology once kept closed. There are reports and rumors of indirect contacts between Israel and Syria, and perhaps even direct talks at some level. No one is presenting this as a breakthrough, but the possibility itself is significant. A more stable Israeli-Syrian border would be a major strategic development, especially if it also restricts Hezbollah's supply lines. The northern front, therefore, contains both danger and possibility. Lebanon may be moving toward direct diplomacy with Israel, but Hezbollah remains armed and dangerous. Syria may be moving toward a regional order less dependent on Iran, but the situation remains fragile. The Gulf states may help shape an anti-Iranian alignment, but the details are still emerging. Back in Lebanon, Prime Minister Salam's public resistance to Hezbollah pressure has drawn attention. Hezbollah has reportedly issued threats against Lebanese political elements involved in diplomacy, including threats of violence. Yet some leaders in Beirut continue to signal that talks should proceed. That takes political courage, but courage alone is not enough. For peace between Israel and Lebanon to become real, Hezbollah must be removed as an armed veto power. The formula is blunt. Hezbollah out, Israel in negotiations, and Lebanon able to speak as a state rather than as a battlefield managed by a proxy. Without that, optimism remains limited. There may be a clear path to peace on paper, but the first condition is that the Lebanese government must be able to control its own territory. If Hezbollah remains an independent army inside Lebanon, any agreement can be undermined by a single rocket team, a single drone launch, or a single order from Tehran. This returns the entire conversation to Iran. Even during 2025, while a ceasefire and agreement were in place with Beirut, the Lebanese armed forces were supposed to be disarming militants and clearing southern Lebanon. Instead, large sums reportedly continued to reach Hezbollah, with estimates ranging from at least $1 billion to possibly $2 billion. That failure is central to Israel's view. Hezbollah is not self-sustaining at this level. Its power depends on Iranian funding, Iranian training, Iranian weapons, and Iranian strategic direction. If Tehran remains strong enough to keep the network alive, then Lebanon remains unstable. The United States understands part of this picture, but Israeli analysts want Washington to draw a sharper line in negotiations. Their argument is that Iran should not be allowed to bring Hezbollah into the nuclear or Gulf discussions as a protected asset. If Washington is negotiating with Iran, then the topic should be Iran's economy, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's conduct in the Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz, not immunity for Hezbollah. In that view, the United States should firmly refuse any Iranian attempt to make Hezbollah a condition of talks. Israel does not want to be pressured into slowing down its campaign against Hezbollah simply because Tehran places its proxy on the negotiating table. That, from Jerusalem's perspective, would reward Iran's regional strategy. For now, Israeli responses in Lebanon have been limited. The IDF has not returned to the wider pattern of strikes seen before the ceasefire, including deeper attacks in Beirut or the Biqala Valley, where Hezbollah maintains important assets. That restraint reflects the diplomatic process, but it also creates concern that Hezbollah is using the pause to recover. This is the balance Israel is trying to manage. It wants diplomacy to have a chance, but it does not want Hezbollah to exploit diplomacy as cover. It wants Lebanon to move towards sovereignty, but it does not trust Lebanon to do the job alone. It wants American support, but it also understands that American priorities may be focused more heavily on Iran's nuclear program than on Hezbollah's daily threat to northern Israel. There was also a separate incident in southern Lebanon that drew justified outrage. 2 Israeli soldiers filmed themselves damaging a statue of Jesus, prompting immediate condemnation from senior military and defense government officials. The IDF moved quickly to replace the statue and remove the soldiers from their combat units. Both soldiers, including the one who filmed the incident and the one who used the hammer, received a 30-day jail sentence. Italian United Nations peacekeepers also donated a replacement statue, and the local community accepted the newly donated replacements. Israeli officials clearly hope the matter ends there, but the incident was treated seriously because it risked harming local religious sensitivities and Israel's broader position. In Lebanon, that episode was not the central story of the front, but it mattered. In a region where symbolism can be weaponized, discipline is not a side issue. It is part of military strategy, especially when Israel is trying to distinguish between fighting Hezbollah and disrespecting the communities among whom Hezbollah operates. The larger picture remains unchanged. The northern front is not out of the woods, but there are unusual diplomatic openings, direct Israel-Lebanon talks in Washington, possible channels with Syria, and regional states with aligned interests against Iran. At the same time, every positive development is shadowed by the same basic problem. Hezbollah has not disarmed. Iran has not abandoned its proxies. The Lebanese state has not fully asserted sovereignty, and Israel is not prepared to wait for another October 7th style failure before acting. Then came a symbolic moment in Jerusalem. President Trump was officially awarded the Israel Prize, the country's highest national honor, during the annual Independence Day ceremony. He is the first non-Israeli ever to receive the prize in the category of special contribution to the Jewish people. When the award was announced in December, Trump had been expected to attend the ceremony in Jerusalem in person. Those plans changed because of the war with Iran. Israel's education minister, Yoav Kish, said in a statement that he could not think of anyone else who had achieved such a remarkable connection to the Jewish people at this time. The president is expected to visit Israel in the coming months when he will be formally presented with the award in person. In ordinary times, that would be a diplomatic story on its own. In this moment, it is also a marker of how closely Israel's current strategic posture is tied to the Trump administration. And that is where the day's stories connect. The ceasefire with Iran is temporary. The naval blockade continues. Hormuz remains volatile. Hezbollah is testing the limits in Lebanon. Syria may be shifting. Washington is divided. Israel is reassessing its dependence on American arms, and the region is waiting for Sunday. Let me be clear. This is not a pause. It is a suspended moment between negotiation and renewed escalation, between blockade and strikes, between diplomacy in Washington and rocket fire in the north. If Iran concludes that pressure will fade, the talks may collapse. If Washington concludes that pressure is not enough, military action may return. If Hezbollah concludes that Lebanon's diplomacy threatens its power, it may try to ignite the northern front. And if Israel concludes that its security is being compromised by delay, it will act. For now, the region is counting hours, not months. The carrier group is moving, the ceasefire clock is running, the talks are continuing, and across Israel, from Jerusalem to the northern border, people are watching the same question take shape. Is this the beginning of a diplomatic exit or just the pause before the next round?